Okay, so now we're going to look at one final t-test version, which is the paired t-test. So the way that I've set this up, some sort of classical representation of this kind of problem would be the pattern that I've got set up here, that you are taking repeat measurements on the same observation. So what I've got here, if we have something that we apply, some supplement, and I'm really interested in the fat content of the fish that I'm growing, and I take one before and after the treatment, and I do that for all of the fish that I have up to sample of N, and so I have 2 measurements on each fish. Now the way that then that data would appear would be that I've got multiple measurements on the fish. So fish 1 I have a measurement before, and fish 1 I have a measurement after. And really what you can see there on the end is that I've got the difference. So what I'm trying to do is say that what I'm interested in is the differences on the individual fish. Now if you think about something like that example, where we can imagine there's a lot of diversity or genetic variation in the individual fish, we're controlling for all that variation. So if we think about our models on how we think about things, I've reduced a whole stack of variability due to the differences in the genetic variability of the fish by taking 2 measurements on each fish. So that's a really effective way for me to understand the impact of this treatment or this supplement that I'm giving the fish. So the core element to understand here is that I'm not actually looking at 2 independent samples. So this scenario is actually different to my coal mine, where I said I was comparing Australian coal and Chinese coal. Here I'm actually looking at 2 related measurements, and when we have related measurements we actually have what's called a paired t-test. It's often called before, it's not exclusively before and after, but the most classic setup for all of these kinds of tests is to do it as a before and after kind of test. So how do we do this? Okay, so my setup, again, we're back to the energy and pollution scenario. Here's my coal mine, and what I'm actually talking about here is not so much the production, but more the mine. And this is a pretty standard setup that we've got here, and if I can just get my little red dot, so that we have some groundwater. All right, and so in this system we're using this, so for our mine we might need to pump this groundwater away, so we would need to contact the environmental regulator to get rid of the underground water to allow us to extract the coal, or and given we tend to stick our power plants right next to the coal body, we use that water and we burn it in steam, and either way we end up with hypersaline water. So if we run this steam, so gradually we're using this water for cooling, over time we collect this, the salt content collects up and we want to discharge hypersaline water. Or it may be a function that actually this underground water, this is something that we face here in Western Australia, we tend to pump the water out into the ocean just because of where our things are. It's not always the case, but when you have this kind of setup, you're going to end up with hypersaline water that you need to discharge somewhere, whether it's into the environment or into the ocean. So here is an example. This is some setup. So this is an underground coal mine. So this is not so much from the production side of things, or the energy production side of things, but actually from the mining side of things. It's called dewatering. So we're mining underground, we're running into water, we need to pump that water away, and it may be that water may have a relatively high salt content, and that changes the electrical conductivity around the environment, and that may have some negative influences. It's maybe perfectly fine to do this. We do a lot of dewatering in Western Australia for basically all of our mines. It just depends on what the water is. You're putting a higher volume of water through something, and that could be an issue, or you could be putting some salt through, or you could be having no impact at all. But in this case, this is sort of trying to have some context. Yes, there's the environmental regulator has received some bad press about this. We can control the salt content in the water being discharged, but it does require spending some money. So we're reluctant to spend the money if we don't have to, and that's a fair enough portion. It's not saying that, we always have to spend the money. It's saying, look, if we're going to have an impact on the environmental conditions, yes, we should spend the money. If it's safe to discharge the water, then that's fine. Like, let's just do that. But let's also monitor it so we know if anything changes. So that's kind of what we want to be in here. So we want to think about monitoring, and we want to have measurements set up along the river. So we're going to have, in before and after sense, we're going to have measurements that we take before we let the mine discharge into the estuary, and we're going to have measurements afterwards, and we're going to take them from the same points. So we've got a paired structure. We've got like a before and after scenario. Now, clearly, we would be worried about things on the upside in this scenario, which means we hit a philosophical position. You can have one-sided tests to only look at whether we're above a threshold, or you can have two-sided tests. This is where you get, the biases of me, which is that I have a philosophical position that there is much more value in always using two-sided tests rather than one-sided tests. My view is that this allows us to pick up unexpected results, and this is based on my experience. Other people have their own experience and have come to different conclusions about single-sided and two-sided tests. I guess the upside for us is that it makes learning steps much, much simpler. So, we're always going to do two-sided tests. So we're interested in changes on the negative or changes on the positive. And for me, that's a philosophical decision, because what if we were discharging very alkaline material? It turned out that it wasn't really about the salt. So anyway, we pick up unexpected results by having two-sided tests. So for us, we're going to load in our salt data. So this is the Excel file name, so salt.test, and this is then the name of the object in R, and we want to look at the data. So we want to apply the structure command, not to the Excel file name, but to the file name that we gave it in R. And down here you can see what we get. We've got location ID. So remember when we were talking about data matrix, this is our ID. So the observations, we're going to have two variables before and after, and they're the rows. So there's some structure to them. Now, what we could do is we could have our measurement. So you can say, here's my before measurement, here's my after measurement. And it actually looks like the electric conductivity after we've been discharging into the environment is lower. Now, what I'm going to say here is that we don't do this, all right? This is a representation for two independent samples. So we don't want to do this. What we want to do, because we've got paired data, we've really got a different series. So we're going to look at, we can look at a histogram of the different series. So this is the before minus intervention. And here is one other way you could look at it. You can plot the two observations before and after, and you can see this cluster. So the down here, measurements, or we've got here. And this is probably my preferred representation of the data for a paired t-test. So what I'm looking at here is you can see that we've taken the difference, and we have this nice scale down here, and I can just eyeball the data. There's 0. So 0 is no change, and I can see that, well, some of the observations are above and below 0, but most of the observations, most of the data, so all down here, is sitting in away from 0. So it looks to me like there is a difference, okay? So let's formalize our null, the mean of the different series. So we don't have independent observations. You can use the language of general language, which is just the mean of the different series is 0. We can also have more specific language when we say, well, the measurements, the difference between the measurements before and after were the same, or the difference of the measurements on electric conductivity before or after were the same. Always have this alpha set to 0.05, which is our critical test for our p-value level. We're going to apply our t-test and interpret the results. So what do we get? So we have, with the data that we applied the t-test to the two variables before and after, And there's this little extra setting here, which is paired equals true. So when we put paired equals true, it's going to conduct a paired t-test. We look at the results. So that's what we have in our script file. It sends our results to the console. When we look at what's in the console, we can see that the p-value is less than 0.05. When the p-value is less than 0.05, we reject the null. And we get our mean of the differences, 49. So it's before minus after. So we have a difference of 40 in our electric conductivity units. So we've found a statistically significant difference. And if we look, went the wrong way. If we looked in here, the real range, it says, probably the true difference is between 30 and about 50, all right? So that's what we think is probably the true difference. The actual sample difference is around 40. So what have we found? Well, we found a statistically significant difference. Does that matter though? That's the question. Does it matter? So if we think about license conditions, so the reference license conditions here were the EC units were 1200. So on a scale of, where our license condition is up to 1200, this is not really very dramatic. But when we think about, if we pick a different reference point, the background level we might be seeing as 50. So you can see, actually we're talking about almost double the natural background level. But it says that on our license condition that we're actually not worried about what happens in the environment to 1200. Then again, we can take some other points and say, just because this is what the license conditions are in Australia, other people have imposed different license conditions as low as 350. So in this case, we're saying, well, the mean before 380, the mean after down at 346. So you can see that, 50 may be a small change, but depending on where we are, it may be significant. If we're looking at comparing to background changes, then it may be significant. If we're comparing to the license condition of 1200, it may be not practically important. So I'm just trying to flesh out to you that yes, you look for statistically significant differences, but then you have to map those differences in what those differences actually are into the framework that you're working with. And that's a good time for a break.